The autumn sun filtered through the tall windows of the courthouse corridor, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. 7-year-old Maya sat on an uncomfortable wooden bench, her small feet dangling just inches above the ground, swinging slightly in a nervous rhythm that betrayed the turmoil churning inside her tiny body. Beside her sat her mother, Jennifer, a woman whose face bore the unmistakable lines of stress and sleepless nights. Jennifer's arm remained wrapped protectively around Maya's shoulders, occasionally pulling her daughter closer, as if that physical contact alone could shield her from the weight of what was about to happen. 3 months. It had been exactly 92 days since that fateful afternoon in September that had shattered their family's sense of safety and normalcy. Maya's therapist, Dr. Williams, had suggested she count the days. Sometimes acknowledging time helped children process trauma, but counting had only made those 92 days feel like 92 years. Every single one had been marked by anxiety, nightmares, and the persistent fear that the world was far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The incident itself had been sudden and violent in a way that a 7-year-old should never witness. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and Maya had been playing hopscotch on the sidewalk outside her apartment building while her mother watched from the front stoop, sipping lemonade and chatting with their elderly neighbor, Mr. Harold. Mr. was 73 years old, a retired firefighter with silver hair and kind eyes that always crinkled when he smiled. He had been their neighbor for 6 years, and in many ways he was like the grandfather Maya had never known. He would give her quarters to buy ice cream from the corner store and taught her how to identify different bird species from their calls. That afternoon, Mr. had decided to cross the street to visit his sister, who lived in the building directly across from theirs. He had waited for the walk signal, stepped onto the crosswalk with his characteristic patience, and looked both ways before proceeding. Maya remembered watching him, her small voice calling out, "Bye, mister, see you later." She had no idea those might be the last normal words they would exchange for months. Then came the sound, a terrible, unmistakable sound that Maya would replay in her nightmares almost every night for the next 3 months. The high-pitched squeal of tires that had lost traction, brakes screaming in protest as they failed to stop a speeding vehicle. Maya's head had snapped around just in time to see a silver sedan racing through the red light at what seemed like an impossible speed. The driver's face had been visible for just a fraction of a second, his eyes wide with panic and something else, something that looked like guilt or knowledge of an incoming disaster. The impact had been catastrophic. Mistress' body had crumpled like a tossed backward by the force of the collision. The sound of breaking bones and the sickening thud of human flesh meeting metal had burned itself into Maya's 7-year-old consciousness with a clarity that would never fade. Her mother had screamed. Neighbors had rushed out of their homes. Someone had called 911, but the silver sedan had not stopped. Instead, the driver had rolled backward slightly, seemed to assess the damage and the gathering crowd, and then suddenly accelerated forward, fleeing the scene with a desperation that only a guilty conscience could justify. Mr. had lain on the asphalt, bleeding and unconscious, while paramedics rushed to the scene. Maya had watched from her mother's arms as they loaded him into an ambulance, her own voice frozen in her throat. That's when she had understood for the first time that the world was not safe, that terrible things happened in broad daylight on ordinary Tuesday afternoons, that people could hurt each other and run away. The investigation that followed had revealed that Mr. had suffered a shattered femur, multiple rib fractures, internal bleeding, and a traumatic brain injury. He had spent 3 weeks in intensive care, and only the skill of an excellent trauma surgeon had prevented his injuries from being fatal. Slowly, painfully, he had begun the long road to recovery, but his injuries were permanent in ways that mattered. He would never walk quite the same way again. He would struggle with chronic pain for the rest of his life. The police had identified the vehicle as belonging to Richard, a 38-year-old man with a history of reckless driving and a string of minor criminal infractions. What they didn't have, however, was a clear witness identification. Security cameras in the neighborhood had captured the license plate and the general appearance of the vehicle, but the driver's face had been obscured by the angle of the cameras and the tinted windows of the sedan. The case was strong on circumstantial evidence. The car, the registration, witness accounts of the vehicle fleeing the scene, but not ironclad without someone who could definitively place Richard in the driver's seat. That someone was Maya. She had seen his face. She had seen the panic in his eyes, the distinctive crescent moon tattoo on his left wrist that had been visible on his arm as he gripped the steering wheel. She had seen everything. And in the days and weeks following the accident, as police officers and prosecutors had gently interviewed her, she had described everything in perfect detail. The police had shown her photo arrays, and she had immediately pointed to Richard's photograph. There was no doubt in anyone's mind that Maya could identify the driver with absolute certainty. But over the past 3 months, something had happened. The weight of that knowledge, the pressure of knowing that her testimony could put someone in prison, had begun to crush her fragile 7-year-old psyche. Her therapist had warned that childhood trauma combined with the stress of legal proceedings could create what she called testimony anxiety. Maya had developed selective mutism in certain situations, particularly in formal environments. She became anxious whenever the case was discussed. Her nightmares intensified. She had difficulty sleeping, concentrating in school, and maintaining her usual cheerful demeanor. Now, sitting outside the courtroom on this crisp November morning, Maya felt as though an enormous weight was pressing down on her small chest. She could hear the murmur of voices from inside the courtroom, the prosecutor, the defense attorney, the judge, all discussing the details of her impending testimony. Today was the day. Today, she would have to stand up in front of everyone and tell them what she had seen. Today, she would have to face Richard across a courtroom and point to him as the man who had nearly killed Mr. Her mother squeezed her shoulder gently. "You're going to be so brave today, sweetheart," Jennifer whispered, though her own voice trembled with uncertainty. "Mr. needs you to be brave. The court needs you to be brave." Maya nodded without speaking, her throat too tight to push words through. She folded her small hands in her lap, noticing how they trembled slightly. A bailiff approached and informed them it was almost time. Jennifer took a deep breath and stood, helping her daughter to her feet. They approached the courtroom doors together, and as Jennifer reached for the handle, Maya felt something close to pure terror flooding through her small body. She had no idea that today would be the day that would change everything, that would transform her from a frightened child into a symbol of courage and truth. The courtroom doors opened with a heavy, deliberate creak that seemed to announce Maya's entry like a dramatic stage production. Bailiff Henderson, a compassionate man in his 50s who had worked in the courthouse system for nearly 30 years, placed his hand gently on the small of Jennifer's back and guided both mother and daughter into the sacred space where justice was meant to be dispensed. The moment they crossed the threshold, the temperature seemed to drop. The courtroom was larger than Maya had imagined, far larger. The high ceilings soared above them, making her feel impossibly small. Dark wood paneling lined the walls, and the afternoon sunlight filtered through tall windows, creating an almost cathedral-like atmosphere that felt simultaneously impressive and intimidating. The courtroom was already populated with people. At the prosecutor's table sat Sarah Mitchell, the assistant district attorney who had been preparing Maya for this moment for weeks. She was a woman in her mid-40s with sharp features and determined eyes that conveyed both competence and compassion. She had visited Maya's school, spoken with her in child-friendly language, and gone to great lengths to make the complex legal process seem less terrifying. She looked up as Maya entered and offered an encouraging smile. At the opposing table sat Richard himself, the man Maya had come to identify as the hit-and-run driver. He was handsome in a rough sort of way, with dark hair and the kind of casual confidence that suggested he didn't believe anything bad would actually happen to him. His expensive suit, a navy blue designer piece that probably cost more than Jennifer's monthly rent, seemed intended to project an image of respectability and success. Beside him sat his defense attorney, Richard Stone, a tall man with slick-back hair and a tailored suit that screamed high-powered defense lawyer. Stone was already studying Maya with the clinical intensity of a predator assessing prey, and Maya felt his gaze like a physical thing pressing against her skin. The judge, honorable, no relation to the family, though the shared surname provided some small comfort, sat elevated at the bench, reviewing documents with practiced efficiency. Judge was a woman known throughout the county for her fair but firm approach to legal proceedings. She had specifically requested that courtroom dog protocols be implemented in this case after reviewing the prosecution's request, understanding that a 7-year-old witness would be severely disadvantaged without appropriate support. But it was what came next that made Maya's breath catch in her throat. As Bailiff Henderson led them toward the witness stand, a door to the right of the judge's bench opened quietly, and a woman emerged leading the most beautiful creature Maya had ever seen. The dog was a golden retriever, tall and elegant, with a coat that seemed to shimmer like liquid gold in the courtroom light. The animal moved with the grace and dignity of a trained professional, each step deliberate and controlled. The dog wore an official vest in navy blue, embroidered with official courthouse insignia, and the name Justice stitched in gold letters. Attached to the vest was a badge that marked her as an official therapy animal, certified by the state and licensed to provide emotional support in legal proceedings. Justice was not just any dog. She had been carefully selected, rigorously trained, and professionally certified through a specialized program that trained therapy dogs for traumatic legal proceedings. Her handler was a certified dog therapy specialist with more than 15 years of experience working with traumatized children in courthouse settings. Justice had worked in approximately 200 legal cases over the past 5 years, and her success rate in helping child witnesses provide testimony was remarkable. She had seen abuse, trauma, abandonment, and tragedy, all the broken pieces of the human experience that found their way into courtrooms. But she never showed judgment. She never showed fear. She simply offered her presence, her calm, and her absolute acceptance. Maya's eyes widened as she watched Justice approach. For a moment, the fear that had been suffocating her seemed to pause, held in suspension by sheer surprise and wonder. She had never seen such a beautiful dog in person. The dogs she knew were the small, nervous poodle that belonged to her aunt and the aggressive German shepherd that guarded the junkyard near her school. This dog was different. This dog carried herself with a quiet confidence that seemed almost human in its wisdom. Justice's handler guided the dog to stand beside the witness stand, allowing Justice to position herself so that she could rest her head near Maya's chair. The dog's movements were precise and practiced. This was not the first time Justice had done this, and she performed her role with the expertise of a professional actor, hitting her marks perfectly. As Justice settled into position, she turned her head slightly and made eye contact with Maya. In that moment, that single, profound moment of connection between a frightened child and a calm, accepting animal, something shifted in the courtroom. Maya felt it immediately. It was as though someone had opened a pressure valve that had been building steam inside her chest for months. Her racing heartbeat, which had been hammering against her ribs like a prisoner trying to escape, began to slow. Her breathing, which had been shallow and rapid, deepened. The sensation of suffocation that had plagued her since the moment she woke up that morning began to ease. It was not that her fear disappeared entirely. It remained, lurking in the background like a shadow, but it was no longer consuming her. It was no longer the dominant force controlling her body's responses. Justice rested her warm, golden head against the chair near Maya's leg, not quite touching but close enough to provide a constant, reassuring presence. The dog's body was warm, solid, and real in a way that seemed to anchor Maya to the present moment, rather than allowing her mind to spiral into catastrophic thinking about what might happen during her testimony. Maya's small hand reached down and gently touched Justice's soft fur. The sensation of the golden retriever's coat beneath her fingertips was grounding and comforting in a way she couldn't fully explain. Judge, watching this interaction with the experienced eye of someone who had seen many child witnesses, made a small notation in her legal pad. She had worked with courtroom dogs before and understood their value implicitly. She looked at Sarah Mitchell and saw the prosecutor's shoulders visibly relax with relief. Mitchell had been concerned about Maya's state of mind, worried that testimony anxiety might completely undermine what should have been a straightforward witness identification. But this change in Maya's demeanor offered hope. Richard Stone, however, observed the same interaction with calculating eyes. His expression remained neutral, but his mind was working. A child bonded to an animal in a courtroom was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it made the child more comfortable and potentially more coherent in their testimony. On the other hand, a jury watching a vulnerable child comforted by a therapy dog was a deeply emotional image that could work against his client. Stone made his own mental notes about how to navigate this development, already formulating strategies to undermine Maya's credibility, despite the emotional sympathy she now generated. Richard leaned over and whispered something to his attorney. Stone shook his head slightly, clearly telling his client to stay calm and let the process unfold, though seemed agitated. He had not expected a therapy dog to be present. He had not anticipated this variable in his carefully constructed defense strategy. Jennifer, watching her daughter's transformation from her seat in the gallery, felt tears of relief begin to form in her eyes. She had been so afraid that Maya would become paralyzed with anxiety when confronted with the formal courtroom environment. She had worried that her daughter's trauma would prevent her from speaking at all, but justice had somehow done in mere minutes what weeks of therapy and preparation had struggled to accomplish. The dog had provided Maya with an anchor, a reason to believe that she was safe enough to tell the truth. As the judge signaled for the proceedings to begin, Maya sat in her chair, her small hand still resting gently on Justice's soft fur. For the first time since that terrible Tuesday afternoon 3 months ago, she felt something that resembled courage beginning to bloom in her small chest. She was ready, not because she was no longer afraid, but because she was no longer alone in her fear. Justice was there, and somehow that changed everything. The bailiff's voice rang out across the courtroom with ceremonial formality as Maya was sworn in. "Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" The words seemed impossibly large and formal for a 7-year-old child, but Maya, with Justice's head resting reassuringly near her chair, managed to nod and say, "I do," in a voice that was steadier than she felt. The jury, 12 ordinary citizens drawn from the community to decide the fate of Richard, turned their attention toward her. Some smiled encouragingly. Others studied her with the kind of clinical interest that made Maya feel like she was being dissected under a microscope. Prosecutor Sarah Mitchell stood and approached the witness stand with deliberate slowness, moving in a way that was designed to be non-threatening. She had worked with child witnesses dozens of times, and she understood that a child's testimony could be as fragile as a soap bubble. One wrong move, one harsh tone, one insensitive question could cause it to burst entirely. She positioned herself at a comfortable distance from Maya, not looming over her or standing too close, but maintaining an accessible, approachable presence. "Hello, Maya," Sarah began, her voice warm and gentle. "I know you're a little nervous today, but I just want you to tell us what you remember about something that happened on September 15th. Is that okay?" Maya nodded, and Justice pressed her head slightly more firmly against the chair, as if to say, "I'm here with you." The small gesture seemed to fortify Maya's courage. "On that Tuesday afternoon, where were you?" Sarah asked, laying the foundation for Maya's account like an architect laying the first brick of a building. "I was playing hopscotch on the sidewalk outside my apartment building," Maya replied, her voice growing slightly louder as she spoke. "Mommy was sitting on the steps with Mister. They were talking and drinking lemonade." The jury members leaned in slightly, drawn into the simple, innocent nature of the scene Maya was describing. This was not a scene of drama or chaos. This was the ordinary, peaceful afternoon that had turned catastrophic. "And what happened next?" Sarah prompted gently. Maya took a deep breath, and her small hands gripped the armrest of the witness stand. "Mister said he had to go visit his sister. He said bye to me, and I told him I would see him later." Her voice wavered slightly on the last words, as if remembering that she almost hadn't seen him again, at least not conscious and whole. Justice's ears perked up slightly, as if sensing the emotional shift in the child's voice, and the dog's presence seemed to deepen, becoming more grounding. "Mister crossed the street right," Sarah continued, guiding Maya through the sequence of events. "Yes, he waited for the walk signal and he looked both ways before he crossed. He was very careful." Maya's tone carried a hint of defensive certainty, as if she needed the world to understand that Mister had done everything right, had followed every rule, and tragedy had still found him. "And then what did you see, Maya?" This was the crucial moment, the threshold between narrative setup and the actual incident. Maya's eyes widened and her breathing quickened. Justice shifted, pressing her body more firmly against the chair. Maya's hand reached down and touched the dog's fur, drawing comfort from the physical contact. "I heard a really loud noise. Really, really loud, like the tires were screaming," Maya said, and several jury members visibly winced at her description. "My head turned around and I saw a car, a silver car. It was going really, really fast, too fast." "Did you see the driver of that car?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. "Yes, I saw his face. He looked scared. His eyes were really big like this." Maya demonstrated by widening her own eyes, and the jury responded to the innocent, visceral description of fear captured on a face. "Can you describe what you saw?" "He had dark hair. His face was. He looked like he knew something bad was about to happen, and his arm was on the steering wheel and I could see his wrist. He had a tattoo." "What did the tattoo look like?" Sarah's voice remained calm and encouraging, though her intensity had sharpened slightly. This was the detail that would either clinch the identification or leave room for reasonable doubt. "It looked like the moon, like a crescent moon, but it was dark, like it was cut out of his skin. I remember thinking it was a weird place to have a tattoo on your wrist like that where everyone can see it." At the defense table, Richard Stone was making rapid notes, already formulating his cross-examination strategy. Beside him, Richard shifted in his chair, and his left hand, which bore the distinctive crescent moon tattoo that was now in evidence, moved slightly beneath the table. "What happened next, Maya?" Sarah asked. "He hit Mister. He was so fast that I didn't think he could stop, but his tires made that screaming sound and the car hit Mister and Mister flew backward. He fell down on the ground and he wasn't moving." Maya's voice had grown smaller, almost a whisper, and the jury members' faces had become sympathetic. Several of them appeared deeply moved by the child's account. "What did the car do after hitting Mister?" "It backed up a little bit. I think the driver was looking at what happened, but then he drove forward really fast and he went away. He didn't stop. He didn't help Mister, he left him there." The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. Sarah had guided Maya through the testimony with precision, and the girl's account was devastating in its clarity and emotional authenticity. The jury members were completely engaged, and several of them were making notes. Judge remained impassive, but her small head nod indicated approval of how the testimony was being elicited. "Maya, I want to show you some photographs now." "Okay." Sarah approached with a folder containing photo arrays, 6 different men's faces, including Richard. She showed them to Maya one at a time, using careful protocols designed to prevent leading the witness. "Can you point to the man you saw driving that silver car?" Maya's finger immediately pointed to a photograph. It was Richard. There was no hesitation, no confusion, no uncertainty. It was a clean, undeniable identification. "Are you sure?" Sarah asked, as much for the record as anything else. "Yes, I'm sure. That's him. That's the man who was driving the car." At the defense table, Richard Stone was already preparing his counterattack. He had identified the vulnerability in Maya's testimony, her youth, her susceptibility to suggestion, the stress of the situation. He would exploit every possible weakness. As he reviewed his notes and began formulating his cross-examination questions, Stone was confident. He had faced hundreds of witnesses, many of them far more composed and articulate than this frightened 7-year-old girl. He was certain he could undermine her testimony sufficiently to create reasonable doubt. Sarah turned to Judge. "I have no further questions, Your Honor." Judge looked at Richard Stone. "Cross-examination, Mr. Stone." Stone rose from his chair, and as he did, Richard placed a hand on his arm and whispered something urgently. Stone nodded, acknowledging whatever instruction his client had given him. Then he turned toward Maya, and his expression hardened into something more predatory. He began walking toward the witness stand, his movements deliberate and designed to project authority and skepticism. Maya felt her heart rate increase as she watched him approach. Justice sensed the shift immediately and pressed her head more firmly against the chair. The dog's eyes remained fixed on Maya, and while the animal couldn't speak words of encouragement, her presence conveyed a single message: "I won't leave you." Stone positioned himself closer to the witness stand than Sarah had, establishing spatial dominance. His opening line was carefully calculated to undermine Maya's credibility from the very first moment. "Now, Maya, isn't it true that you were playing with your phone when this accident happened, and therefore couldn't possibly have seen everything as clearly as you claim?" The cross-examination was beginning, and it would be far more brutal than anything that had come before. Richard Stone took a position directly in front of the witness stand, close enough that Maya had to crane her neck slightly to look up at him. This was deliberate. Stone had spent 30 years perfecting the art of courtroom intimidation, and he understood that physical positioning was a tool as powerful as any verbal argument. By standing close and towering over the small child, he was establishing dominance. By making her uncomfortable, he was already undermining her confidence. His first question had been designed to do exactly that. "Now, Maya, isn't it true that you were playing with your phone when this accident happened, and therefore couldn't possibly have seen everything as clearly as you claim?" It was a trap, pure and simple. Whether Maya said yes or no, Stone could twist her answer. Yes meant she was distracted and unreliable. No meant she was lying. Maya's hands trembled visibly on the armrest of the witness stand, and she looked down at Justice, seeking reassurance. The dog's eyes remained locked on hers, calm and steady. I don't have a phone," Maya stammered. "I was playing hopscotch." "Right, you were playing hopscotch. A game that requires your complete attention, doesn't it?" Stone's tone carried an edge of sarcasm, though he maintained an expression of innocent inquiry. "So you were completely focused on hopping from square to square, weren't you? Which means your attention was divided." "No, I heard the noise and I looked up," Maya tried to explain, but her voice had become quieter, less certain. "But if you were concentrating on your game, how could you have heard the noise quickly enough to see the driver's face? Surely by the time you looked up, the car would have already been past you." Sarah Mitchell started to object. "Your Honor, that's argumentative and assumes facts not in evidence." Judge held up a hand. "Sustained. Mr. Stone, please rephrase your question to avoid argument." Stone appeared unperturbed by the objection. He had gotten exactly what he wanted, an objection that interrupted Maya's train of thought and further destabilized her confidence. He continued, his voice now dripping with skeptical intonation. "How many seconds would you say elapsed between when you first heard the car and when you turned around to see the driver's face?" I don't know, a few seconds." Maya's answer came as a question, betraying her uncertainty. "A few seconds could be 3 seconds, or 5 seconds, or even 10 seconds, correct?" Stone pressed. "I guess so," Maya replied weakly. "And in that time, the car was moving very fast, correct?" "Yes." So the car had already begun to hit Mister by the time you turned around, hadn't it? You didn't see the moment of impact. You saw the aftermath, correct? Maya felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. She was becoming confused, doubting herself. She looked down at Justice, and the dog seemed to sense the child's distress. Justice moved slightly closer, pressing her body more firmly against the chair, and placed a paw as close to Maya as possible without disrupting the proceedings. Justice's handler remained still but alert, monitoring the situation carefully. "I saw his face," Maya said, her voice breaking slightly. "I saw the driver's face. It was him." She pointed toward Richard, but her certainty sounded like a question. Stone pounced on that uncertainty like a predator sensing weakness. "You're pointing to Mister now, but earlier you identified him from a photograph array. Isn't it true that prosecution counsel may have inadvertently indicated which photograph was Mister's? It's easy to imagine a child picking up on subtle cues from an adult, isn't it?" "Your Honor," Sarah Mitchell stood abruptly. "That's completely inappropriate. The photo array procedures were conducted according to strict guidelines specifically designed to prevent such contamination." "Sustained," Judge said firmly. "Mr. Stone, you are out of line. Ask proper questions or I will restrict your cross-examination." But the damage was done. The seed of doubt had been planted. Some jury members were now looking at each other, considering the possibility that Maya's identification might have been influenced by adult suggestion. Stone had violated the spirit of the rules, if not the letter, and he had created an impression that would linger long after Judge's admonishment. Stone continued his assault on Maya's credibility, shifting tactics. "You said the car was silver, correct?" "Yes," Maya confirmed. "Silver or gray? Because in low light conditions, silver can sometimes appear more gray, can't it?" "It was silver," Maya said, but the questioning made her doubt herself. "You also said you saw a crescent moon tattoo on the driver's wrist. A crescent moon can sometimes look like other shapes, can't it? A C shape, for instance, or a curved line." "No, it was definitely a moon," Maya protested weakly. "But you're 7 years old, Maya. Have you studied tattoo art extensively? How many tattoos have you actually seen in your lifetime?" Stone's questions were coming rapid fire now, giving Maya no time to compose herself between answers. Each question was designed to sow doubt. Each question was intended to suggest that a 7-year-old's perception and memory were fundamentally unreliable. Stone was painting a picture of a frightened child whose mind had filled in details that she hadn't actually observed, whose memory had been contaminated by suggestion and her own imagination. Jennifer sat in the gallery, her hands clenched into fists in her lap. She wanted to jump up and stop this assault on her daughter. She could see the toll it was taking on Maya, the trembling hands, the wavering voice, the tears that now freely flowed down her small cheeks. "Isn't it possible, Maya, that you've confused details over the past 3 months? That you've told this story so many times, to police, to prosecutors, to your therapist, that you've actually created a false memory that feels completely real to you?" That question struck like a blow. False memory, contamination, suggestion. These were the seeds Stone was planting in the jury's mind, and they were taking root. Several jury members were now regarding Maya with expressions of sympathy mixed with skepticism. They felt bad for the child, but they were beginning to doubt the reliability of her testimony. Maya's shoulders shook with suppressed sobs. She looked desperately toward her mother, toward the prosecutor, toward anyone who might help her. And then she looked at Justice. The dog had remained in her position of steadfast support throughout the entire cross-examination. She hadn't wavered. She hadn't doubted. She was simply there, present, unchanging. Justice's dark eyes met Maya's with absolute acceptance. The dog didn't judge her confusion or her tears. She didn't question the reliability of her memories. She simply offered her unwavering presence. "I know what I saw," Maya said quietly, her voice barely audible in the courtroom. But even as she said it, Doubt crept into her tone. Stone had accomplished what he set out to do. He had created the impression that Maya was an unreliable witness whose testimony could easily be the product of imagination, suggestion, and the fallibility of a 7-year-old's memory. Stone continued for another 15 minutes, pummeling Maya with questions designed to undermine every detail of her testimony. By the time he finally said, "No further questions, Your Honor," Maya was thoroughly shaken. Her confidence had been systematically dismantled. The jury was left with the impression that while Maya might genuinely believe what she was saying, that belief didn't necessarily mean her testimony was reliable or accurate. Judge called for a brief recess, and as the bailiff helped Maya down from the witness stand, the girl's legs were shaking so badly that she could barely walk. Sarah Mitchell reached out to steady her, offering quiet words of encouragement. "You did great, Maya. You told the truth." But even as Sarah said it, she could see the doubt in the child's eyes, and she knew that Stone's brutal cross-examination had done significant damage. The prosecution's seemingly strong case was now resting on the shaky foundation of a thoroughly traumatized child whose credibility had been systematically attacked and undermined. As Maya sat back down next to her mother, pressing close against Jennifer's side, Justice remained at her post, waiting for the moment when the child might need her again. The courtroom had become and a 7-year-old girl was being treated like a combatant rather than a victim trying to speak the truth. The recess had lasted 30 minutes, but it might as well have been 30 seconds. The courtroom reassembled with all the key players returning to their positions: judge, attorneys, jury, court reporter, bailiff, and the gallery of observers who had come to witness justice being dispensed, or at least attempted. Maya sat in the witness stand once again, though this time she looked diminished, almost hollowed out by the assault of Stone's cross-examination. Her eyes were red and puffy from crying. Her small hands were clasped together so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Justice remained at her post, as steadfast and present as she had been during the worst of the questioning. But even the dog's unwavering support seemed insufficient to restore the confidence that had been systematically erased. Judge surveyed the courtroom and then looked at Richard Stone. "Mr. Stone, do you have additional questions for the witness?" Stone stood with deliberate slowness, straightening his expensive suit and approaching the witness stand once more. He had clearly decided that one round of questioning was not enough. He wanted to finish what he had started, to completely discredit Maya's testimony and leave the jury with no choice but to question everything she had said. "Just a few more questions, Your Honor," he said smoothly. "Maya, I want to make absolutely certain the jury understands how unreliable memory can be, particularly in children your age. You've now told this story many, many times over the past 3 months, haven't you?" "Yes," Maya answered quietly. "Each time you tell it, don't you add a few more details? Don't you remember additional things that you didn't remember the time before? That's how memory works, isn't it? Each retelling causes the memory to shift and change and become less accurate." Sarah Mitchell objected immediately. "Your Honor, that's not supported by current neuroscience regarding how child memories work, and it's argumentative." Judge sustained the objection, but Stone had already made his point. The jury had heard what he wanted them to hear. He continued undeterred. "Maya, you said the driver looked frightened, but you were also frightened, weren't you? Isn't it true that you were so frightened by what was happening that you might have misinterpreted his expression? What looked frightened to you might actually have been surprise or confusion or something else entirely, correct?" "No, he was scared," Maya insisted, but her voice had become almost inaudible. "And when you saw the crescent moon tattoo, weren't you perhaps already thinking about the man you would later identify? Didn't your mind somehow imprint the tattoo onto his image, because you had already been told by the police that they were looking for a man with a distinctive tattoo?" The question was designed to be unanswerable. It suggested that Maya's mind had been contaminated by police suggestion before she had even consciously identified the driver. It implied that what she thought she remembered might actually be a constructed false memory planted by authority figures. Maya felt the walls closing in. She couldn't breathe. The courtroom seemed to spin around her. She had tried so hard to be brave, to tell the truth, to help Mr. and the system find justice. But Stone was making her feel like a liar. He was making her doubt everything she had witnessed with her own eyes. He was suggesting that her mind, her perception, her memory, all of it was fundamentally unreliable. "I know what I saw," Maya whispered, but even she could hear the doubt in her own voice. Stone smiled, a thin, predatory smile that suggested he believed he had won. He was about to ask his final question, the one that would drive the final nail into the coffin of Maya's credibility. "Isn't it possible, Maya, that you've confused this man's face with someone else's face you've seen? Or that you've seen Mr. around the neighborhood and your mind has conflated that previous encounter with?" But before Stone could finish his question, something shifted in the courtroom. It was subtle but profound. Maya's eyes, which had been downcast and filled with tears and doubt, suddenly lifted. Her gaze moved from Stone, past the jury, past the judge, past her mother sitting rigid in the gallery. Her eyes found Justice. The golden retriever sat perfectly still, her head slightly raised, her dark eyes locked on Maya's with an expression of absolute, unwavering faith. In that moment, a single moment that felt suspended outside of time, something profound passed between the child and the animal. It was not words. It was not logic or reason or legal argumentation. It was something far more fundamental. It was trust. It was belief. It was the simple, undeniable recognition that there was at least one being in this courtroom who did not doubt her. One being who believed in her absolutely. And in that moment, Maya understood something crucial. Justice didn't care about Stone's clever questions. Justice didn't care about false memories or suggestion or the fallibility of child witnesses. Justice simply knew, with the kind of instinctive wisdom that only animals possessed, that Maya was telling the truth. The dog's presence had never wavered, not for a single second, because Justice could recognize authenticity when she encountered it. That recognition, that unwavering faith from one innocent being, was all Maya needed. She stood up in the witness stand, not dramatically, not in anger, but with a quiet, absolute certainty that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her soul, a place that fear and doubt could not reach. Every person in the courtroom sensed the shift immediately. Judge's eyes widened slightly. Sarah Mitchell leaned forward with sudden interest. The jury members straightened in their seats. Jennifer's hand flew to her mouth. Richard Stone froze mid-sentence, his question dying on his lips as he watched the transformation occurring before his eyes. Maya pointed directly at him, her 7-year-old finger extended with absolute conviction, and she said 2 words with a clarity and power that seemed impossible coming from such a small child. "You're lying." The courtroom erupted into chaos. The words were not technically responsive to Stone's question. They were arguably not even appropriate for a witness to say, but they were devastating in their impact. They were the words of a child who had finally found her voice, who had stopped doubting herself, and who was speaking a truth so fundamental that it transcended legal procedure and courtroom protocol. Judge immediately banged her gavel. "Order, order in the court." But the damage, or rather, the healing, had been done. Stone's face flushed crimson. He opened his mouth as if to object, to argue, to somehow regain control of the situation. But what could he say? The jury had witnessed something profound. They had seen a traumatized child recover her courage. They had witnessed what appeared to be absolute certainty spoken with the kind of clarity that was impossible to fake. Richard's face had gone pale. He leaned over urgently and whispered frantically to his attorney, but Stone was momentarily speechless, which was something few people had ever witnessed. The defense attorney's carefully constructed strategy of discrediting Maya had suddenly collapsed under the weight of those 2 words. Maya remained standing, her finger still pointed at Stone. her eyes locked on his with a directness and intensity that belied her 7 years. Behind her, Justice had risen to her feet as well, her body aligned with Maya's, the two of them standing together in a moment of crystalline truth. Sarah Mitchell, sensing the momentum shift, immediately said, "Your Honor, I have no further questions." Judge looked at Stone. "Do you have any additional questions, Mr. Stone?" Stone sat down heavily, shaking his head slightly. "No, Your Honor, no further questions." The judge looked at Maya. "You may step down, young lady." As Maya climbed down from the witness stand, she reached out and hugged Justice, burying her face in the dog's golden fur. The courtroom remained absolutely silent. What everyone had just witnessed was not a legal maneuver or a clever argument. It was the transcendent moment when a child had found her courage and spoken a truth so absolute that it could not be argued away or legally maneuvered around. The prosecution had just witnessed its star witness transform from a liability into a symbol of truth itself, and the defense had just watched its best strategy implode in the face of a clarity that no amount of clever questioning could overcome. Judge had called for a 30-minute recess immediately after Maya's stunning declaration. The courtroom had been cleared of spectators while the attorneys remained in a tense huddle with the judge in her chambers, discussing the unexpected turn of events and the jury's obvious reaction to what had just transpired. Now, as the recess continued, Sarah Mitchell sat in the prosecutor's office on the 3rd floor of the courthouse building, her mind racing with possibilities. Something about Maya's absolute certainty, that moment when the frightened child had stood up and pointed at Stone with unwavering conviction, had triggered something in Sarah's investigative instincts. She had been practicing law for 23 years, and she had learned to trust her gut when something felt significant, and this moment had felt profoundly significant. Sarah pulled out her case file and spread the documents across her desk, reviewing everything that had been collected during the initial investigation. They had the vehicle registration, the eyewitness accounts from people who had seen the silver sedan fleeing the scene, the police report documenting the accident. But there was something they didn't have, something that had been bothering Sarah from the moment the case began. They didn't have definitive proof that Richard had been in the driver's seat. The security camera footage from the surrounding area had been spotty. The cameras on the street where the accident occurred were old and poorly positioned, capturing only the vehicle itself, not the driver's face clearly. But Sarah suddenly remembered that there was a gas station 2 blocks away from the accident scene. A gas station that she had walked past dozens of times. A gas station with modern security cameras that faced both the pumps and the street. She grabbed her phone and called her lead investigator, Detective Wu, a meticulous man with an almost obsessive attention to detail. "I need you to do something for me." "Immediately," Sarah said without preamble. "Pull all security footage from the Shell station on Mercy Avenue, the one 2 blocks from the accident scene. I need footage from September 15th, specifically from 3:30 p.m. to 4:30 p.m., and I need you to look for a silver sedan with front-end damage." "Sarah, we already looked at that gas station," said slowly. "The manager said the cameras weren't working that day." "I know what was said. I want you to go back and verify that personally. Check their backup systems. Check their cloud storage. Check everything. Something tells me those cameras were working, trust me." There was a pause, and Sarah could almost hear the detective's analytical mind working through the request. Had learned to trust Sarah's instincts over the years, and he knew that she wouldn't ask for this without good reason. "I'm on it," he said finally. "Give me 20 minutes." Sarah hung up and paced her office, which was a small, cluttered space decorated with law school diplomas and photographs of cases she had successfully prosecuted. 20 minutes felt like an eternity. She kept replaying that moment in the courtroom, Maya's finger pointing directly at Stone, her voice cutting through all the procedural noise and legal maneuvering with the force of absolute truth. Her phone buzzed with a text from "Coming back to office. You need to see this." 15 minutes later, burst through her office door, and Sarah had never seen him look so excited. The typically reserved detective was practically vibrating with the energy of discovery. "The cameras were working," announced, not bothering with preamble. The gas station manager had deactivated them for a few hours due to some technical glitch, but they came back online at 3:47 p.m., which is exactly 16 minutes after the hit-and-run accident. Placed a laptop on Sarah's desk and opened a video file. The footage was crystal clear. A silver sedan, its front bumper clearly damaged and hanging at an odd angle, pulled up to the gas pump. The timestamp read 3:47 p.m., September 15th. Sarah leaned forward, her heart rate accelerating. The driver's door opened and Richard stepped out. There was no ambiguity. There was no question. It was undeniably him. The distinctive crescent moon tattoo was clearly visible on his wrist as he gripped the door handle. "There's more," said, his voice taking on an even more urgent tone. He clicked another file. "I found audio. There's a gas pump next to where parked, and there was a customer at that pump when arrived. Our forensic audio specialist cleaned up the ambient sound and was on his cell phone. Listen to this." Hit play, and the audio crackled through the speakers. It was tinny and somewhat distorted, but the words were unmistakable. "Yeah, I'm at the Shell station on Mercy. Listen, don't ask questions. I had an accident. I hit something. Someone, I don't know, but I'm getting out of here. Nobody saw me. Nobody saw the car. I'm dumping this thing at Joey's place tonight and we're going to strip it down. Nobody's going to find anything." The voice was undeniably Richard's. His probation officer, who was in the room, confirmed it immediately. Sarah felt goosebumps rise on her arms. This was beyond what she had hoped for. This was a confession, captured on audio, with a timestamp placing at a specific location 16 minutes after the hit-and-run, which gave him no time to claim he was elsewhere or that he hadn't been involved. "Who was the customer at the pump next to him?" Sarah demanded. "A woman named Jennifer," replied. "She's already agreed to testify that she heard the phone conversation. She thought it was a prank at first, but when she saw the news about the hit-and-run, she realized what she had witnessed." Sarah stood up and began packing, her mind already calculating the implications. This evidence was completely independent of Maya's testimony. It didn't rely on a child's memory or perception. It was objective, verifiable proof that Richard had been the driver, that he had known about the accident, and that he had deliberately fled the scene with intent to conceal evidence. "Can we verify the vehicle ownership?" Sarah asked. "Already did," confirmed. "The silver sedan is registered to Richard. We have registration documents, insurance paperwork, everything. There's no question that it's his vehicle." "And the customer who heard the phone call, is she credible?" "She's a teacher. She has no connection to the case, no bias. She's willing to testify. And she has the date and time written in her personal calendar because she thought the incident was so strange that she wanted to document it." Sarah sank back into her chair, a wave of relief washing over her. The case that had seemed to be crumbling under Stone's brutal cross-examination had just been resurrected with evidence that was irrefutable and completely independent of Maya's testimony. "How much time until we need to present this to the court?" Sarah asked. "The audio has been cleaned up and the video has been authenticated. Jennifer is available to testify. We can present this afternoon if you want." Sarah looked at the clock. "Judge will reconvene in 15 minutes. We need to inform the defense counsel that we have new evidence. Come on." As they hurried back to the courtroom, Sarah felt a sense of profound vindication. This evidence didn't just help the prosecution's case. It completely validated everything that Maya had claimed. The child's testimony about the crescent moon tattoo, about the silver sedan, about the driver's panic-stricken expression. All of it was confirmed by objective evidence that could not be argued away or discredited. When they entered the courtroom, Sarah immediately requested a sidebar with the judge. She informed Judge and Richard Stone that the prosecution had discovered significant new evidence. Stone's face went pale as Sarah described the security footage and audio recording. He tried to argue that the evidence should not be admissible, that it was discovered too late, that it constituted improper investigation. But Judge was unmoved. "This evidence is clearly admissible, Mr. Stone. The prosecution has every right to introduce new evidence that becomes available during the course of the trial. And frankly, the existence of this evidence only strengthens the reliability of the child witness's earlier testimony. It corroborates her account in every detail." As the attorneys returned to their positions, Richard leaned over to Stone and whispered urgently. Sarah could see the panic in his face, could watch as the realization dawned on him that his situation had just become catastrophically worse. The case that had seemed to be slipping away in the face of Stone's expert cross-examination had suddenly transformed into an unwinnable situation for the defense. Maya's testimony, combined with this new evidence, created an airtight case. Sarah caught Maya's eye from across the courtroom and saw the relief and vindication on the child's face. Justice, sitting near the witness stand, seemed to sense the shift in energy and appeared to straighten with satisfaction, as if to say, "I told you she was telling the truth." The revelation of this evidence marked the moment when justice, the concept and the dog both, began to prevail. The presentation of the new evidence had taken less than 2 hours. Sarah Mitchell had walked the jury through the security footage frame by frame, establishing chain of custody for the video and audio recordings. Detective Wu about the investigation procedures and the verification of the audio's authenticity. Jennifer, the teacher who had overheard S's phone confession, had taken the stand and calmly described what she had heard, consulting her personal calendar to confirm the date and time. The impact on the courtroom had been devastating for the defense. Richard Stone had attempted to discredit the audio evidence, suggesting it could have been doctored or that there was ambiguity in the voice identification. But his arguments had rung hollow. The jury members had watched the video. They had heard the audio in their own ears. They had seen and heard the evidence with their own senses, and no amount of legal maneuvering could make them unsee or what had been presented. Judge had given her final instructions to the jury at 4:47 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon. The jurors had retired to the deliberation room at 5:15 p.m. Now, at 7:42 p.m., they had returned with a verdict. The bailiff had summoned everyone back to the courtroom. Sarah Mitchell stood with her team, her expression carefully controlled but her heart racing with anticipation. Richard Stone sat rigidly beside his client, and beside him, Richard looked like a man whose world was collapsing. His expensive suit, which had seemed like armor that morning, now hung on him like the trappings of defeat. His hands trembled visibly as he gripped the edge of the defense table. Maya sat in the gallery with her mother, Jennifer's arm wrapped protectively around her daughter's shoulders. Justice had been allowed to remain in the courtroom, and she stood near the gallery, her intelligent eyes moving between Maya and the judicial proceedings with an awareness that seemed almost human in its perceptiveness. The dog seemed to understand that something momentous was about to occur. Judge entered and took her seat at the bench with the measured dignity of someone who had presided over countless trials and understood the weight of the moment. She looked out at the assembled parties. "I understand the jury has reached a verdict," Judge stated formally. "Bailiff, please bring in the jury." The jury file filed back into the jury box, and Sarah noted with professional satisfaction that they were not looking at Richard. In her decades of courtroom experience, she had learned that when jurors don't look at a defendant as they return with a verdict, it typically indicated a guilty verdict. Conversely, jurors who had voted to acquit often made eye contact with the defendant, perhaps as a form of silent communication that they had given him the benefit of the doubt. The foreman, a man named David, no relation to Judge or Maya, was a retired electrician in his 60s who had been selected for his apparent ability to think logically and follow complex instructions. He held a card in his trembling hand, a card that would determine the fate of Richard and the lives of everyone in that courtroom. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge asked. "We have, Your Honor," David replied. "Please read the verdict on the charge of leaving the scene of an accident with injuries," Judge instructed. David opened the card and read in a clear, steady voice, "We find the defendant, Richard, guilty." The word hung in the air like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples spreading outward to touch everyone in the courtroom. Richard's face went pale. His attorney placed a hand on his arm but seemed not to feel it. He sat frozen, staring at the jury foreman as if perhaps he had misheard the words. Jennifer in the gallery quietly began to cry, tears of relief streaming down her face. She pulled Maya closer, and Maya reached over and took her mother's hand. "Please read the verdict on the charge of reckless endangerment," Judge continued. "We find the defendant, Richard, guilty," the foreman read. Another guilty, and then another moment of absolute silence in the courtroom, as if everyone were holding their breath simultaneously. "Please read the verdict on the charge of vehicular assault," Judge said. "We find the defendant, Richard, guilty," David read, his voice never wavering. 3 guilty verdicts, all counts, complete and utter vindication of the prosecution's case and complete and utter destruction of the defense's strategy. Sarah Mitchell allowed herself a single moment of satisfaction, though she maintained her professional composure. She had won. Justice, in the legal sense, had prevailed. But it was the reaction in the gallery that would become the enduring image of that moment. Maya had stood up slightly, her small body trembling, and she looked directly at Richard. Their eyes met across the courtroom, separated by rows of benches and the vast distance between guilt and innocence. In that moment, Maya seemed to understand something profound, that by telling the truth, despite her fear and despite the assault on her credibility, she had helped to hold someone accountable for their actions. She had made a difference. Justice the dog moved forward slightly, pressing against the gallery railing, and if a dog could smile, Justice's expression would have matched the satisfaction visible on her face. Judge began reading the standard post-verdict instructions. "The jury has found the defendant guilty on all counts. The defendant will remain in custody pending sentencing. Sentencing will occur in 30 days, during which time a pre-sentence investigation report will be prepared." Richard Stone stood and asked to approach the bench, where he filed a motion for a new trial, which Judge immediately. The legal formalities were being observed, but everyone in the courtroom understood that the trial was effectively over. As the bailiff moved to remove Richard from the courtroom, the defendant turned and looked directly at Maya one more time. His expression was complex, part anger, part regret, part the dawning realization of the consequences of his actions. He had hit a man and left him for dead. He had tried to evade responsibility. He had subjected a 7-year-old child to intimidation and doubt in an attempt to escape justice. And now, sitting in a courtroom in a navy blue suit that suddenly seemed like a costume, he had to face the full weight of those choices. As was led away, Sarah Mitchell turned to see Maya being embraced by her mother. The child's face was flushed with emotion, relief, vindication, perhaps even a sense of justice in its truest form. The dog Justice stood with them, completing the triangle of truth-telling, support, and the pursuit of justice itself. Later that evening, after the courtroom had emptied and the attorneys had packed their files away, Sarah found herself standing in her office, replaying the events of the trial in her mind. The case had seemed lost when Maya's confidence had been shattered by Stone's brutal cross-examination. But the child had found her courage, pointed at the truth, and spoken 2 words that had reverberated through the entire legal proceeding. And then, as if the universe itself had wanted to reward that courage, the evidence had emerged to validate everything Maya had claimed. The sentencing hearing would come in 30 days. Judge would have the discretion to impose anywhere from 3 to 15 years in prison, depending on the pre-sentence investigation report and her assessment of the defendant's character and circumstances. But regardless of what sentence was ultimately imposed, the fundamental question had been answered. Richard was guilty. He had hit Mr. He had fled the scene. He had attempted to obstruct justice, and now he would face the consequences. Sarah looked at the photograph on her desk, a picture of her own daughter, who was 9 years old. She thought about what Maya had endured during this trial, what trauma a child had been forced to process in order to tell the truth. And she felt a renewed commitment to her work, to using the law not as an instrument of power or clever manipulation, but as a mechanism through which truth could triumph over falsehood, and accountability could be imposed on those who harmed others and then tried to escape the consequences. The guilty verdict had been delivered. Justice, in its legal sense, had prevailed. But the real victory, Sarah understood, belonged to a frightened 7-year-old girl who had found the courage to speak the truth, even when everything in her world suggested she should stay silent. 3 weeks had passed since Richard received his sentence, 5 years in a state correctional facility, with the possibility of parole after serving 3 years with good behavior. Judge, in her sentencing remarks, had been particularly eloquent about the gravity of his crimes, and the fact that his initial attempt to evade responsibility had caused additional harm to an innocent child witness. The impact statement from Mr. delivered from his wheelchair in the courtroom, had moved even the most hardened courtroom observers to tears, as he described the physical pain and psychological trauma he had endured as a result of reckless driving and subsequent flight. But today, on a crisp November Saturday morning, exactly 1 month after the guilty verdict, the focus was not on punishment but on recovery and healing. Maya stood in the doorway of Mr.'s modest home, holding a bouquet of sunflowers that she had selected specifically, because she remembered him mentioning that sunflowers were his favorite. Her mother stood behind her, offering quiet support. Mr. sat in a comfortable chair near the window of his living room, his right leg elevated on a cushioned ottoman. He was still healing. The orthopedic surgeon had indicated that full recovery would take another 6 months of physical therapy. But he had returned home from the rehabilitation facility 3 days ago, and his doctors were optimistic about his long-term prognosis. Maya, Mr.'s face illuminated with genuine delight when he saw the child. "Come here, sweetheart." Maya moved forward and carefully hugged Mr., conscious of his injuries, but desperate to offer the human contact that both of them needed. For the first time since that terrible Tuesday afternoon 3 months ago, the connection between them felt untainted by trauma or fear. There was no specter of hit-and-run or courtroom testimony hanging between them. There was simply 2 people who cared about each other, reunited in a moment of authentic connection. "I brought you sunflowers," Maya said shyly. "They're beautiful," Mr. replied, accepting the flowers and gesturing for Jennifer to help place them in a vase. "And you know what? You've been brave enough to make my life beautiful again. When I was lying in that hospital bed, I wasn't sure I'd ever make it home. I wasn't sure I'd ever walk again. But your courage in that courtroom gave me something to hold on to. It gave me hope." Maya's eyes glistened with tears. "I was so scared during the trial. When that mean lawyer was asking me all those questions, I thought I was going to forget what I saw. I thought maybe I wasn't remembering it right." "But you were remembering it right," Mr. said firmly. "And you found the strength to tell the truth even when it was hard. That's the definition of real courage, Maya. Courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is doing the right thing even when you're terrified." The conversation drifted to lighter topics: Mr.'s physical therapy, the birds he had been observing from his window, a new book he was reading. But the emotional scaffolding had been built. Both Maya and Mr. were healing, and that healing had begun in the moment when a frightened child had stood up in a courtroom and pointed at the truth. Meanwhile, in the downtown courthouse, significant changes were being implemented. Following the high-profile success of justice in Maya's case, the state's judicial administration had approved an unprecedented expansion of the courtroom dog program. Funding had been allocated for 3 additional certified therapy dogs to serve the district. Justice, who had become something of a local celebrity following media coverage of the trial, was now joined by 2 other golden retrievers and a chocolate Labrador, all specially trained in trauma-informed witness support. Judge had written an open letter to her colleagues in the judiciary, describing the profound impact that Justice's presence had on Maya's testimony and the ultimate success of the prosecution's case. The letter detailed the peer-reviewed research on animal-assisted therapy in legal proceedings and made a compelling argument for the expansion of such programs across the state. Within weeks, 3 other counties had begun their own courtroom dog initiatives, all looking to replicate the success of Justice's model. Sarah Mitchell, the prosecutor, had been invited to speak at the state's annual judicial conference about the importance of trauma-informed practices in handling child witnesses. Her presentation included video footage of Maya's testimony, showing the dramatic transformation that occurred when the child found support and courage through connection with justice. Several other prosecutors in attendance began inquiring about how they could access courtroom dogs in their own jurisdictions. Justice herself, now officially recognized as the Courage Dog in local media coverage, had become the public face of a movement toward more humane, psychologically informed legal proceedings. Justice's handler had been inundated with requests for interviews, appearances, and training opportunities. She began developing a formalized curriculum for training additional courtroom dogs, drawing on the success protocols that had been so effective with Justice. But perhaps most significantly, a new nonprofit organization had been founded specifically to provide courtroom dog services to communities and child witnesses without resources to afford private therapy dogs. The organization, called Justice for All, had been established with a generous grant from an anonymous donor, a donor who, to most people, was Richard, who had decided that his settlement from homeowners insurance would be used to help other children who found themselves in situations similar to the one Maya had endured. 4 weeks after the guilty verdict, on a Saturday afternoon, Maya returned to the courthouse with her mother, not for legal proceedings but for something entirely different. Justice had been given the afternoon off and had arranged for Maya to spend time with the dog in the judge's private chambers, a room decorated with personal touches and far more comfortable than the formal courtroom itself. When Maya entered, Justice immediately rose from her resting position and approached the child, her tail wagging with genuine happiness. Maya knelt down and wrapped her arms around the golden retriever's neck, burying her face in Justice's soft fur. For several minutes, they simply remained like that, child and dog, silently reconnecting in a moment that required no words. "Justice missed you," said gently. "She has a remarkable ability to remember the children she works with. She remembers their fear, but more importantly, she remembers their courage." "I missed her too," Maya admitted. "When I was scared in the courtroom, it was Justice who made me brave. She never doubted me. She never made me feel like I was lying or confused. She just believed in me." Smiled. "That's exactly what Justice does. She believes in people when they need it most. And you know what? I think Justice believes you're one of the bravest people she's ever met." Later that evening, Maya sat in her bedroom journaling, something that her therapist, Dr. Williams, had suggested as a way to process her experiences. She wrote about the trial, about Stone's harsh questions, about that crucial moment when she had found justice with her eyes and discovered the courage she needed. She wrote about how different everything felt now, how the nightmares had stopped, how she could sleep through the night without waking up terrified. But most importantly, she wrote about what she had learned. She had learned that truth had power. She had learned that speaking up, even when you're afraid, even when people try to make you doubt yourself, was profoundly important. She had learned that sometimes courage came from unexpected places, like a golden retriever wearing an official vest. She had learned that one child with one voice could make a difference in the world. The case of the People v. Richard would eventually fade from the headlines. Other trials would capture public attention. Justice would work with other traumatized child witnesses, helping them find their voices and their courage. Mr. would complete his physical therapy and regain much of his former mobility, though he would walk with a slight limp for the rest of his life, a permanent reminder of that terrible afternoon. But for Maya, the impact of that experience would ripple through her entire life. She had discovered something about herself that she would carry forward into adulthood, the knowledge that she was capable of telling the truth even in the face of powerful opposition. She had learned that fear and courage were not opposites. They could exist simultaneously, and it was what you did despite your fear that mattered. And in the years to come, when other children found themselves in similar situations, frightened, uncertain, facing cross-examination from skilled defense attorneys determined to undermine their credibility, Justice and her handler would be there. The program that had begun with one golden retriever and one terrified 7-year-old girl had become a statewide initiative, and eventually a national model for how the legal system could better serve the most vulnerable witnesses. Maya's courage had not only helped Mr. receive justice, it had transformed an entire system, one dog, one child, one truth at a time.